Thank you very much, and welcome to those of you in the room and those online. My name's Dr. Kristie Baisden. I'm an OBGYN, and I serve on the maternal health team at the FDA. And as was mentioned, I'll be sharing this presentation with Dr. Miriam Dinatale, who is a team leader on the maternal health team and a family medicine physician. We're going to be speaking about pregnancy and lactation labeling rule, or PLLR. We're 4 years into the PLLR now that went into effect in 2015, so we'll talk a little bit about that and then talk about next steps that the agency is taking for research in pregnant and lactating women. This is a topic that is particularly interesting to myself on both a professional level as an OBGYN who works on prescription drug labeling, but also on a personal level as I'm currently pregnant with my 4th child. So, okay, let's get started. So just the standard disclaimer that you've seen today. Our learning objectives today will be to discuss the agency's key considerations for PLLR labeling conversion. We will discuss omissions of clearly inapplicable or misleading information and when to include labeling recommendations for pregnancy testing, contraception, and infertility. Then we will discuss recently published guidances related to pregnancy and lactation and steps that the agency is taking to increase research specific to pregnant and lactating women. As an outline, we'll start with an introduction, then we'll discuss PLLR implementation and tracking by the agency. We will review what to consider when submitting PLLR compliant labeling. Then we will discuss content considerations for PLLR. Next, we'll review new guidances related to pregnancy and lactation, and finally, efforts to advance research in pregnant and lactating women. So to get started, just introduce our division, DPMH, the Division of Pediatric and Maternal Health. We're located within the Office of New Drugs, O&D, within the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, CDER, within the FDA. Our division is composed of 3 teams, the maternal health team, the pediatrics team, and the pediatrics regulatory team, which supports both maternal health and pediatrics. On the pediatric side, DPMH's mission is to oversee quality initiatives which promote and necessitate the study of drug and biological products in the pediatric population. And on the maternal health side, our mission is to improve pregnancy and lactation-related information in prescription drug labeling. To outline our role with PLLR, we basically provide consultation to CDER and CBER, which is the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. And we consult with the review divisions and issues related to maternal health, including pregnancy, lactation, as well as infertility in females and males of reproductive potential. We also collaborate within the agency for consistency of process related to PLLR. We're currently involved in revising the draft guidance for PLLR. In addition, we track the product labeling compliance with PLLR, and I'll discuss that a little bit more next. And we participate in events such as this CDER Labeling Conference to raise awareness of PLLR amongst external and internal stakeholders. So moving on to PLLR implementation. In this table, you will see the schedule for PLLR implementation, which essentially the PLLR went into effect in 2015. We're now 4 years in, so we're at this 2019 cohort. So I'll try to explain this table a little bit more. But basically, it applies to NDAs, BLAs, efficacy supplements, as well as 505(b)(2) and biosimilar applications that are required to have labeling meet PLLR format and content requirements, effective as of when the rule went into effect, June 30th of 2015. So in the green here, you can see that all new NDAs, BLAs, and efficacy supplements that are initially submitted on or after June of 2015 they're required to submit labeling in the PLLR format at the time of submission of the new NDA, BLA, or efficacy supplement. Moving on to the blue, we have, for products that were approved between 2001 and 2015 or pending as of June 30th, 2015, we have 3 separate cohorts, a 2018, 2019, and a 2020 cohort, depending on the year of approval. We're currently working on this 2019 cohort, And the next cohort that we'll be expecting are, in the red here, products approved between 2002 and 2005, which we anticipate to come in June of next year. And then finally in the yellow, for products, NDAs or BLAs approved prior to June 30th of 2001 that undergo voluntary PLLR conversion, they're required to submit PLLR labeling at the time of the voluntary PLLR conversion. So we've been tracking this table to see how we're doing. And between June 30th of 2015 and June 30th of 2019, over 1,300 applications have been approved with labeling that complies with PLLR. For 2018 cohort, we anticipated approximately 294 applications that were required to comply with PLLR format and content. Of those, 286 applications were submitted. 208 were approved in PLLR format. 78 are still under review, and 8 applications were not submitted. For 2019, the cohort we're currently working on, approximately 730 applications were required to comply with PLLR format and content. Of those, 620 were submitted, and 335 have been approved. Many of the others are still under review by the agency. And for the upcoming cohort for 2020 next year, we anticipate approximately 367 applications. So moving on, we're going to discuss some considerations for when applicants are submitting PLLR compliant labeling. So what should be included? First, you need the labeling to actually comply with the content and format of the PLLR, along with a review and summary of all available published literature regarding drug use, not just in pregnancy and lactation, but also any known effects of a drug on male and female fertility. We're also looking for inclusion of a cumulative review and summary of relevant cases reported to your pharmacovigilance database, so not just over the past few years, but specifically from the time of product development to the present. In addition, we're interested in seeing a summary of drug utilization rates amongst females of reproductive potential in the age of 15 to 44 years that's been calculated cumulatively since initial approval of the product. If applicable, an interim report of an ongoing pregnancy registry or a final report of a closed registry should also be included. And this updated PLLR labeling and supportive information should be submitted in Module 1 of the submission. And I want to emphasize when you're submitting this information for PLLR that we're really looking for information about safety. We're not as interested in efficacy information, but we really want to know if this product causes any safety concerns in pregnant, lactating women or any adverse effects on fertility. Another consideration is when we think of PLLR, we think of 8.1 pregnancy, 8.2 lactation, 8.3 females and males of reproductive potential. But what we also want applicants to consider is that there may be other sections of the labeling that apply that need to be updated. So applicants should review and update these other sections that are pertinent to PLLR as well. For example, in 8.3, if you have a recommendation for pregnancy testing with use of the product, you also should update Section 2, dosage and administration, with recommendations to verify pregnancy testing, to verify pregnancy status prior to administration. Other sections may be relevant, such as contraindications, warnings and precautions, clinical pharmacology, patient counseling information, as well as patient labeling. These all should be updated as necessary when updating the labeling to the PLLR format. So now we'll discuss some content considerations. First, we'll start with omissions. So the PLLR states that in some circumstances, applicants must omit certain subsections or specific information otherwise required under the PLLR because it is clearly inapplicable or misleading. When doing such, applicants should provide their rationale and justification for any proposed PLLR labeling submission for review by the agency. Sometimes there may be a question or a concern about the applicability of a section of labeling that is related to PLLR, and the applicant should discuss their proposed omission with the agency and provide a rationale for this omission. So here's an example of when Section 8.1, 8.2 have been omitted from PLLR labeling. Here's a product that's really only indicated for use in premature infants. So trade name is a surfactant. indicated for the rescue treatment, including the reduction of mortality and pneumothoraces of RDS in premature infants. In this particular example, 8.1 pregnancy and 8.2 lactation were omitted from labeling because this information is clearly inapplicable. Pregnant women and lactating women or females of reproductive potential are not going to be using this product. So 8.1 and 8.2 do not apply. Moving on, we'll talk about some content considerations for section 8.1 pregnancy, particularly related to the risk summary. And we'll talk through human data, animal data, and potential pharmacological risk summaries. So to start with, for 8.1 pregnancy, we want to discuss some considerations for the risk statement based on human data. This can often be a challenge to develop. Determining whether pregnancy exposure data truly establish a drug-associated risk is quite a complex process, and it requires an assessment of both the quality of available data and the quantity of available data. And the purpose of the risk summary is to help prescribers really try to understand that benefit risk of prescribing a drug. We find it important, and we've heard from our Risk Communication Advisory Committee meeting that we held in 2018 that prescribers are really interested in understanding what types of available data we have for pregnancy. And we recognize that often this data is very limited or there may be no data at all. But when it is available, we try to describe the types of available data in section 8.1 risk summary, including if there is pregnancy registry data available versus cohort studies, case control, case series, or only case reports. And again, I want to emphasize that our focus here is on evaluating the safety of the drug and pregnancy outcomes following exposure to this drug, as opposed to the efficacy of the drug in pregnancy for section 8.1. Moving on to animal data for the risk summary. So again, there's a lot of considerations when we're developing these statements and when determining the potential human risks from animal data. And I've listed several of them here. Does the adverse developmental outcome occur in more than one animal species? Is the adverse developmental outcome consistent across animal species? What is the relative animal to human exposure? And we like to see those exposure multiples reported in AUC versus BSA so that the exposure multiple is less likely to be overestimated. Does the adverse developmental outcome occur in the absence of maternal toxicity or not? And are there positive signals in other drugs of the same class or with the same mechanism of action? And the presence or absence of these factors can increase or decrease concern, and some factors can carry greater weight than others. For example, toxic drug exposure may be manifested as one type of adverse developmental effect, such as embryo lethality in animal species, but a different type of adverse developmental effect, such as a structural abnormality in humans. And it may really not be possible to conclude that a drug causes an increased risk based on a particular type of developmental effect only based on animal data alone. And I just want to highlight that on the maternal health team, we really rely quite a bit. This is a multidisciplinary process when we're trying to develop these animal data risk statements, and we really rely heavily on the expertise of our pharmacology toxicology colleagues within the FDA and trying to understand the relevance, the clinical relevance of the animal data and potential for adverse effects in humans. So moving on to the risk statement based on pharmacology. If a drug has a well-understood pharmacological mechanism of action that may result in adverse developmental outcomes, the risk summary must explain the mechanism of action and potential associated risk. And you should also include a cross-reference to clinical pharmacology section where the pharmacological data on which the risk summary is based can be more fully described. So here's an example where you have a drug that has multiple considerations for the risk summary. You have animal findings of concern, you have a mechanism of concern, and you really don't have much human data. And we've been asked the question quite a bit, well, which one do I present first? The animal data, the human data, the pharmacology? How do we determine which to do first? And really, we consider this on a case-by-case basis, depending on how much human data we have, what the mechanism of concern is, what the animal data suggest. So in this particular example, this is a drug that's indicated for the treatment of non-small cell lung cancer. This drug has concerning animal findings, and mechanism of action, it interferes with microtubule assembly and inhibition of mitosis at metaphase that may cause adverse developmental effects. And there's really limited human data. In this situation, the animal and the pharmacology statement is included first because this is the most important information to communicate to prescribers. And the order in which the human, animal, and pharmacology risk statement is presented, as I said, is really determined on a case-by-case basis. So in this example in 8.1, we have a statement that says, based on findings from animal studies and its mechanism with the cross-reference to clinical pharmacology 12.1, trade name can cause fetal harm when administered to a pregnant woman. Available human data are insufficient to inform the drug-associated risk of major birth defects, miscarriage, or adverse maternal or fetal outcomes. And then we go on to just give a brief statement about the animal data that are available, and later they are summarized in the animal data section. Advise a pregnant woman of the potential risk. So moving on to subsection 8.2, lactation for content considerations. For drugs that are systemically absorbed by the mother, unless breastfeeding is truly contraindicated, which there's really very few situations where breastfeeding is absolutely contraindicated. A contraindication is really when there's a risk to the patient, which would be the lactating woman. So an example of that would be radioactive iodide, which can accumulate in the breast tissue and increase the woman's exposure to radiation. And so there would be a contraindication. But generally, contraindications are not that common. We have a lot of breastfeeding is not recommended statements, which I'll talk about next, but there aren't really a lot of contraindications. So unless breastfeeding is contraindicated, the labeling under the risk summary heading must include the following risk and benefit statement when we think breastfeeding is okay at the end of the labeling under the risk summary heading. The developmental and health benefits of breastfeeding should be considered along with the mother's clinical need for the drug and any potential adverse effects on the breastfed child from the drug or from the underlying maternal condition. Now, as I mentioned, when the drug's not really contraindicated, but breastfeeding is not recommended during use because of a potential risk to the breastfed child, such as a cytotoxic drug, the labeling should include a statement describing the reasons to avoid breastfeeding. And again, if breastfeeding is not recommended, this would be a time when we would not include the risk-benefit statement. It should be omitted because including such a statement could be misleading. And then finally, when we have human data that are available, human clinical lactation studies, for example, or published reports of use of a drug in lactation, animal data regarding lactation must not be included unless the animal model is specifically known to be predictive for humans. So now I'm going to turn the presentation over to my colleague, Dr. Dinatale, and she'll go over some content considerations for 8.3 as well as other information. Thank you for your attention.
All right, great. Thank you, Dr. Baisden. So at this point, we're going to turn our attention to subsection 8.3, females and males of reproductive potential. We're going to take a look at the three separate headings: pregnancy testing, contraception, and infertility. So when the FDA has determined that pregnancy testing is required or recommended, so when I say required, this is a product that has a REMS specifically for fetal harm. And then when I say recommended, is there's some fetal harm, there's a concern, so we say recommended. The labeling under pregnancy testing must include this information. So in terms of the timing and frequency of pregnancy testing and the type of pregnancy testing, this is individualized to the patient. So this information isn't specifically included in labeling. In addition, if there is pregnancy testing in 8.3, this information would also be added to other sections of labeling as applicable. For example, dosage and administration would also include information about pregnancy testing. When the FDA has determined that contraception is required or recommended before, during, or after therapy with the drug use, because there's some sort of adverse fetal developmental outcome, then a contraception heading would also be included under 8.3. And then if applicable, this information would also be included in other sections of labeling, for example, under highlights, warning and precautions, under patient counseling information. If data from non-clinical studies or the mechanism of action raises a concern about mutagenesis, a summary of this information and its clinical implications would also appear under the contraception heading. And then when pertinent, there would be a cross-reference to the non-clinical toxicology section, which would include a detailed description of these non-clinical studies. If data from non-clinical studies do not raise concern with respect to mutagenesis, then the information would only be included under Section 13, non-clinical toxicology. If there are pharmacokinetic studies of semen that inform the need for contraception, then there would be a summary of these pertinent findings under the contraception heading, but there would be a cross-reference to the pharmacokinetic section of clinical pharmacology where there would be a more detailed description of these studies. So there are some instances in which the drug use information pertinent to females and males of reproductive potential that's not necessarily related to adverse developmental outcomes. And here's a situation. If there's an interaction between a drug and hormonal contraception, there would be a summary statement concerning this interaction and a recommendation for use of a non-hormonal or additional barrier method of contraception that would be discussed under 8.3. There would then be a cross-reference to the drug interaction section, Section 7, where there would be a more detailed description of what this interaction is. So under the infertility heading, this is where there would be a description of available human data that demonstrate adverse effects on male or female fertility. There would also be a description of what is known about the potential reversibility of these adverse effects if known. If there's no available human fertility data, then no statement is needed. If data from animal studies or there's a mechanism of action that suggests concerns about impaired human fertility, then there would be a summary of this information and its clinical implications under infertility. And then when pertinent, there would be a cross-reference to non-clinical toxicology where there would be a more detailed description of these studies. If the animal studies do not raise concerns with respect to human fertility impairment, then the information would only be described under Section 13.1. So we've taken a look at the different sections of PLLR. We're coming up to our last cohort. What's next? So we've heard that healthcare providers still want a quick take. There's still a paucity, there's a lack of human data in pregnancy and lactation. And then the challenge that we face is how do we communicate this risk when there's limited data coupled with uncertainty? So in March of 2018, the agency held a risk communication advisory committee where we discussed what's being presented in the pregnancy sections of labeling and what could be done to improve and clarify these recommendations in the communication of risk between the healthcare provider and the pregnant woman. So this advisory committee recommended that we do some end-user healthcare provider focus group testing. And the agency has been approved to do this study listed here, and it's called PLLR end-user testing to improve health communications. So the aims of this study is to help identify the gaps in healthcare provider understanding of PLLR content and labeling so that we can improve the risk communication between the healthcare provider and the pregnant woman. And then the study is also working to develop approaches for the presentation of pregnancy information and labeling. For example, maybe coming up with some graphical representation to improve the communication of this risk. We're also seeking funding for a similar project on the lactation side. So I briefly want to cover some of the new guidances that just came out this year. And the first guidance is the Post-Approval Pregnancy Safety Studies guidance that published in May of 2019. And this replaces the 2002 Pregnancy Registry guidance. And it reflects recommendations from the 2014 FDA public meeting of stakeholders that discussed how to best collect safety information in pregnant women after the drug is approved. And I've included a link to this guidance here. So briefly, what this guidance does, it expands on the previous pregnancy registry guidance. It also includes information about other epidemiologic studies and pregnancy surveillance programs. And it describes 3 general approaches used in the post-marketing setting to evaluate the safety of a drug during pregnancy. So it takes a look at pharmacovigilance, pregnancy registries, and complementary data sources. The next guidance is the Clinical Lactation Studies Guidance, and this also published in May of this year. And this replaces the 2005 lactation guidance. And what it does, it provides information to facilitate the conduct of lactation studies. And such studies are important because they can inform breastfeeding with drug use recommendations. As I noted, there really isn't much information in terms of the drug use during pregnancy. There's even less data in terms of lactation and drug use. The guidance link is also provided on the slide for your reference. Briefly, this guidance describes specific study designs that can be considered. For example, a milk-only study, a milk plasma study, and a mother-infant pair study. And it also takes a look at some clinical pharmacology considerations such as milk sampling methods, PK analysis, and calculation of estimates of infant doses, and also discusses some infant safety considerations. So again, there's a lack of information in pregnant and lactating women. So what are we doing? So first off is the Task Force on Research Specific to Pregnant and Lactating Women, and this is known as PRGLAC. And this group was required under the 21st Century Cures Act of 2016. And it's made up of federal members, including representatives from NIH, NICHD, CDC, FDA, HHS. Also includes some non-federal members from other medical societies, nonprofit organizations, and from industry. So the objective of this task force is to identify and address gaps in knowledge and research regarding safe and effective use of therapies in pregnant and lactating women. Phase 1 of this task force was completed in September of 2018. And basically, it involved the preparation of a report of 15 recommendations to the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. We're currently under Phase 2 of this HHS. Basically, HHS reauthorized the PRGLAC task force to continue the work to implement these 15 recommendations. And this charter was extended to March of 2001. There is FDA representation on this task force, as I mentioned, and there are actually members from DPMH that are part of this group. There are 4 working groups that are part of this task force. The first group is research and training, and this group focuses on increasing the quantity, quality, and timeliness of research and safety on drugs in pregnant and lactating women. The next working group is the regulatory group, and this includes and integrates pregnant and lactating women in the clinical research agenda. And then it also removes the regulatory barriers to research in pregnant women. The third group is the communication group. This group is working to create a public awareness campaign to engage the public and healthcare providers in research on pregnant and lactating women. And finally, the discovery working group that develops programs to drive discovery and development of therapeutics for conditions that are specific to pregnant and lactating women. I've included a link below so you can learn more about PRGLAC. Here are a couple of resources that might be helpful to you. There's our draft guidance in the link provided, more information about the pregnancy and lactation labeling file labeling rule, and then prescription drug labeling resources. And then some additional information in terms of where to find product labeling. For example, FDA label, drugs at FDA, Daily Med. LacMed is helpful for more information about lactation, and then links to CDC and the FDA Office of Women's Health Pregnancy Registry website. So thank you for your attention. I'd like to briefly go through challenge questions. So we're going to do this by a show of hands. So the question here is a true-false question. In some circumstances, certain subsections or specific information that is otherwise required under PLLR must be omitted because it is clearly inapplicable or misleading. How many say true? Good. Anybody say false? Right, the answer is true. And the second question here is, what are the main topics discussed in the Clinical Lactation Studies Guidance? Is it A, clinical lactation studies can inform breastfeeding with drug use recommendations, including in the lactation subsection of labeling. B, it describes specific study designs that can be considered, for example, milk only, milk plasma studies, or mother-infant pair studies. C, it describes clinical pharmacology considerations. D, it describes infant safety considerations. Or E, all of the above. How many say A? E, C, D, or E? Great. All right, you're all listening. It is E. All of the above is correct. All right, great. Thank you all for your attention.